On the edge of the Virginia woods, where the roads turned to dirt and the air carried the smell of wet pine, Reverend Silas Merriweather unlocked the chapel door each Sunday before dawn. The building sat like a forgotten tooth, its paint worn away, its windows fogged with age. He would walk the central aisle slowly, fingertips brushing each pew as if counting them, his lips moving in silent greeting to faces that weren't there. At the pulpit, he opened the great Bible with a care that bordered on reverence, smoothing each page, straightening the binding, and looking up at the empty room with the steady gaze of a man who saw something no one else could. To anyone watching from the doorway, it was a service without a congregation, the preacher's voice drifting into hollow air, yet his eyes scanned the benches as if they were filled with listeners. He would pause at certain points, smiling faintly, nodding toward vacant seats, and then continue, his tone dipping into the softness one might use when speaking to the dying. The locals called him peculiar but harmless, the kind of man whose mind had simply wandered from the world. Yet in the past year, 3 families had stopped coming to town altogether, their shutters drawn, their fields left to rot. People told themselves they had moved, perhaps westward, chasing land or fortune. But when a mill worker swore he saw one of the missing women at a chapel window long after her home had been abandoned, the whispering began. Those whispers deepened when a hunter found a bonnet in the creek, its fabric stiff with something darker than water. No one confronted Merriweather directly. His sermons, though strange, were laced with the language of salvation, and in a place where God's authority weighed heavier than the law, few dared to question a man of the cloth. Still, there was unease in the way his parishioners, what remained of them, spoke of his late-night lights. The candle glow moving from pew to pew, the shadows that bent in ways they shouldn't. Some said he was praying for souls that had not yet crossed over. Others whispered of an older belief, the kind that tied the living and the dead in the same room until the preacher decided the bond was broken. Inside the chapel there was a faint, constant scent, iron and something sweeter, that no amount of pine boughs could mask. When the wind rattled the boards just right, a low sound would hum through the floor, a vibration that seemed to carry breath with it. Merriweather would sometimes kneel mid-sermon, lowering his head as though to listen closely, then rise again with renewed vigor, his voice swelling as though the silent ones had answered him. To the townsfolk, the missing were merely gone. To Merriweather, they were still here, arranged in their rightful places, invisible to doubting eyes but entirely real to him. The truth was that each disappearance was not random, not sudden, but chosen, selected by him for reasons only he understood. He kept his gaze on certain families during market days, watching how they moved, how they spoke, whether they met his eyes or lowered them. Those who lingered in his thoughts too long would be invited to confession, a meeting behind the chapel's heavy doors from which they would never return. What happened after that was not spoken of, not even by the walls, though the marks on the wooden floor suggested something had been dragged, something heavy, from the altar toward the back. The people who feared him feared more the idea of being proven right. To speak of what might be inside that chapel was to risk being summoned there yourself. And so the Sundays continued, the Reverend's voice echoing for hours, each service ending with him closing his Bible, patting the cover as one might a sleeping child, and whispering a benediction to the empty air. In his mind, the congregation had never been more devout, never more obedient, never more silent. Beyond the chapel doors, the woods grew thicker, the paths more overgrown, as if nature itself was trying to seal the place off. Yet at night a dim glow would leak through the warped boards, and those who passed on the road would swear they heard singing, not the loud, joyous hymns of a living congregation, but something slower, lower, like voices trapped between breaths. The fear in town was no longer of losing more people. It was of realizing that they were never truly gone, only moved somewhere no one dared to follow. That knowledge pressed against the minds of those who stayed, planting the question that would one day have to be answered. What exactly sat in those pews, and how long had they been there? It began with the smallest absences, the sort of vanishings polite society in rural Virginia could explain away with a shrug. A wife too frail for market day, a brother who had taken ill and needed rest. But the pattern hardened with each passing month. The ones who accepted Reverend Merriweather's invitations to private confession were simply not seen again. Their homes remained locked, their livestock sold off in quiet deals, their names spoken in softened tones. The Reverend spoke of them from the pulpit with a serene certainty, claiming they had chosen to retreat from the world to purify their souls. He produced letters from them, pages written in the shaky hand of the missing, speaking of inner peace and urging their loved ones to wait for their return. The town accepted these words because questioning them would mean acknowledging something too monstrous to imagine. The letters smelled faintly of the chapel, of incense masking something raw, older, the sort of scent that clung to a place after blood had been scrubbed from wood. Behind the locked doors of his sanctuary, Merriweather kept his congregation exactly where he wanted them, upright, silent, and unblinking. The coffins were narrow and stood like soldiers along the hidden wall behind the altar. Each was fitted with a viewing slit, not for air, but so he could watch their eyes. He starved them in precise measures, never enough to allow death its swift mercy. Instead, he kept them suspended between life and the grave, feeding them just enough broth to maintain a flicker of consciousness. Their bodies thinned into shadows of themselves, muscles wasting until they could no longer stand on their own. Yet the wooden frames forced them to remain vertical, like obedient parishioners in an eternal service. He spoke to them as he preached to the empty pews, his voice calm and measured, as though he were guiding them through some great spiritual trial. In his mind, this was salvation by attrition. To strip away the body was to free the soul, and only he could decide the pace of that liberation. He believed their suffering was a kind of sermon in itself, a living lesson for his eyes alone. When one faltered too far toward death, he would lean close to the slit, watching their gaze struggle to focus. He would whisper that they had not yet earned the silence he required. A small cup of water would be pressed to their cracked lips, enough to draw them back from the edge so the process could begin again. Their minds broke before their bodies did, and he studied the moment of that fracture with almost scientific fascination. He marked the days it took for their eyes to stop pleading and start staring through him, an unseeing devotion he considered his greatest proof of righteousness. The sound in the chapel changed as the famine of faces grew. The Sunday air was no longer filled only with his sermons, but with the faint, uneven scratching of fingernails on the coffin walls, the subtle creak of wood as weakened bodies shifted within their prisons. These noises pleased him. They meant his congregation was listening, that they were held in the place between this life and the next where he claimed God's voice was clearest. He timed his sermons to their weakness, lengthening the pauses between his words until their breath came in shallow sync with his own. Outside, families clung to his explanations because they feared the alternative. To confront him would mean demanding to see inside the chapel, and none dared to break the seal of a man who spoke so gently of divine things. And so they waited for their loved ones to return from these so-called retreats of the soul, never knowing that those retreats ended not in renewal but in the slow extinguishing of flesh and will. Merriweather saw himself as the keeper of a holy famine, one that would sweep through the land until all souls were pared down to the purity he envisioned. The absence of familiar faces in town became to him a sign of progress. Each missing person was another seat filled in his unseen congregation, another voice that, in its silence, joined the harmony he believed only he could hear. What began as an oddity was now a pattern, and the Reverend was careful to nurture it, choosing his next invitation with the same deliberation a surgeon applies to the first cut. In his world, the pews were never empty. They were simply occupied in a way no one else could see. And the hunger in those coffins, the methodical unmaking of the human body, was the truest form of worship he could imagine. Meriwether's cruelty evolved with precision, as if every new method was the natural next step in some private doctrine he was perfecting. The famine he had cultivated in his congregation brought him a quiet satisfaction, but starvation alone was not enough. Too often, their pain tried to speak. Too often, the muffled whimpers behind coffin slits disturbed the controlled rhythm of his sermons. It was not the sound of suffering that bothered him. It was its unpredictability. He wanted their agony to be clean, disciplined, stripped of the chaos of pleading. In his mind, words were the last defiance of the sinful body. If he could remove them, he would have complete dominion. His training as a young medical apprentice had taught him the anatomy of the mouth in fine detail. The branching nerves, the texture of muscle, the way a tongue could be drawn forward and immobilized. He had assisted with procedures meant to save speech after injury, but now he reversed them with the steady hands of a man certain of his purpose. One by one, those who had been weakened by hunger were removed from their upright prisons, carried under the pretense of granting them rest, and placed upon the heavy table in the small chamber behind the altar. There, in the low light of tallow candles, his tools lay neatly arranged on white cloth, knives honed to surgical sharpness, bone-handled hooks, and lengths of fine wire. The air carried the mingled scents of boiled linen and the faint copper tang of blood that no amount of scrubbing ever fully erased. He worked slowly, not from hesitation but from the belief that each cut should be deliberate. His hands moved without tremor as he incised just enough to loosen control of the tongue without severing it entirely. He wanted them to live, to breathe, to hear. He wanted them to feel every vibration in their throats when they tried to speak and found only broken syllables and wet, shapeless sounds. When the first victim's mouth filled with the thick gurgle of pain, Meriwether's face remained serene. He bound the wound with cloth steeped in vinegar and herbs, a ritual as much as a practical measure. In his eyes, the sealing of their speech was the sealing of their sins. The muffled cries that followed were different, no longer words, only the animal breath of pain and panic. This pleased him. It meant the pews would be filled with bodies whose silence was absolute, whose devotion could never be corrupted by language again. The psychological toll on his victims was as carefully curated as the physical. Deprived of the ability to beg or curse, they began to retreat inward, their eyes wide and searching for meaning in his calm, unblinking gaze. He would visit them in the hours after the procedure, standing close enough for them to see his lips form prayers they could not echo. The humiliation was as intentional as the pain. He knew the mind could shatter under the weight of enforced silence faster than under any whip or blade. Each altered parishioner was returned to their coffin, still able to hear every word of his sermons, but now incapable of disturbing their rhythm. In time, even the involuntary groans would fade, replaced by the shallow breaths of the obedient. The town noticed the change, though they could not name it. When Meriwether's voice carried from the open chapel windows on Sundays, there was an odd absence, a hollow undercurrent where the coughs, rustles, and quiet responses of a normal congregation should have been. To the Reverend, that emptiness was proof of perfection. To outsiders, it was simply unsettling, the kind of quiet that made you feel watched. Meriwether's medical skill gave his atrocities a clinical air, masking them in the trappings of care. If challenged, he could have spoken convincingly of surgical necessity, of treating strange illnesses that afflicted his flock. but no one asked. In the early 19th century, such procedures were the domain of the learned, and common people dared not question a man who spoke with the authority of both doctor and priest. And so the silence deepened, inside the chapel, inside the coffins, and inside the minds of those who feared what they might hear if they listened too closely. With each tongue he altered, the Reverend's conviction hardened. He was crafting not just a congregation but a choir of silence, their devotion measured in the stillness of their lips. The anatomy of the human voice had become his canvas, and with every cut he believed he was painting something pure. What others would call mutilation, he considered refinement. And in the suffocating air of that wooden chapel, the absence of words became the loudest sermon he would ever preach. The Reverend's chapel had long since stopped smelling of cedar polish and hymnals. The air now carried a sweetness that clung to the back of the throat, a scent of rot masked with cheap incense. In the flickering light of the altar candles, Merriweather's eyes lingered on the edges of his great Bible, tracing the worn leather as if it were an object of living devotion. To him, it was incomplete, lacking the sacrifice needed to make it truly holy. The inspiration had come one rain-heavy evening when he read from a Puritan punishment manual gifted to him years earlier by a visiting English minister. The book was dense with archaic scripture, but in its margins were notes on discipline of the flesh. Punishments meant not for death, but for correction. Flaying, branding, and the removal of skin as a lesson in humility before God. The Reverend saw not cruelty in these acts, but scripture in motion. A man could shed his pride the way a tree shed its bark. A woman could be stripped of sin as one stripped the hide from a lamb. He began slowly, careful not to break the fragile bodies that now filled his upright coffins. A victim whose spirit had been dulled by hunger and silence was easier to work with. He would wait for the chapel to be empty of outsiders, then drag one captive into the narrow preparation room behind the altar. The tools were simple, a short curved blade honed thin as paper, and strips of linen boiled in lye to wrap the wound. His cuts were never deep enough to end a life in one motion. Instead, he took only a narrow ribbon of skin from the forearm or the back of the thigh, long and clean, working with the precision of a man slicing fruit. The first cut always drew a muffled, gurgled cry, what remained of their damaged voices. But the Reverend did not flinch. He would whisper that the pain was the body's hymn to God, and that their sacrifice would be remembered long after their flesh was gone. The wounds were bound tightly to stop the bleeding, but never to comfort. The bandages were meant to keep the vessel alive for the next harvest. In his twisted logic, to take too much at once was to rob the soul of the chance to repent further. He wanted them to feel each session, to dread his approach in the days between. And they did. In their coffins, eyes darted in terror at the sound of his steps on the wooden floor, their breaths quickening when his shadow passed over them. He fed on that fear as much as he fed on their bodies. In the privacy of his study, he prepared each strip. The flesh was pressed flat between heavy boards, dried with salt until it stiffened, then trimmed to fit the dimensions of a page. These were sewn with careful stitches into the margins of his Bible, hidden beneath ornate covers he had inherited from his father. Only when he read alone did he open to those altered pages, running his fingers across the uneven texture as if each one carried the warmth of the soul it came from. The more he worked, the more he believed the Bible was becoming something no other preacher possessed, a living scripture bound in the very humanity it sought to save. The psychological toll on his captives was no less severe than the physical. They began to recoil even in the confines of their coffins, their emaciated frames pressing against the wood as if it could swallow them whole. The anticipation of the next visit was a torture in itself, stretching the hours into days that felt endless. Some stopped sleeping, too afraid they would wake to his hands on their skin. Others tried to wound themselves further in desperate attempts to make their flesh unusable, but their weak bodies could not muster the strength. Meriwether saw these acts of defiance as signs of progress, proof that the harvest was stripping away their earthly will and forcing them toward the purity he envisioned. As the number of altered pages in his Bible grew, so did his obsession. He began to see the absence of these victims in town as not merely a consequence of his work, but as a form of divine editing. The community was being rewritten just as his Bible had been, its sins removed strip by strip, its people refined into something worthy of his vision. And though no one in the town had yet dared to confront him, the absence of familiar faces was starting to weigh on the air like a sickness, pressing down on those who remained. To Meriwether, the sickness was not a disease to cure, but the shadow of salvation. Each time he closed his Bible after reading from the secret pages, he felt a growing certainty that the world outside the chapel was irrelevant. All that mattered were the souls he had bound in silence, bled in hunger, and now stitched into the Word of God itself. And in the stillness of those candlelit hours, he believed the book whispered back to him. To Meriwether, the suffering he inflicted was never random. It was a sermon, and every act had to hold meaning. The hunger had stripped their strength, the silencing had stolen their words, and the harvesting of skin had turned their bodies into scripture. Yet he believed there was still one element missing, one final layer of devotion that could only be proven through the act of dying in place, seated in his pews, eyes fixed on him until the end. That belief took form in his most guarded ritual, which he called the glass communion. It began with the preparation, carried out in the still hours before dawn. In the small room behind the pulpit, he laid a length of linen across the table and poured a jar of wine, its deep red already suggestive of blood. Beside it, he placed a mortar filled with shards of pulverized glass, ground fine enough to mix unnoticed into the liquid but sharp enough to tear through the flesh of anyone who swallowed it. He stirred the mixture slowly, the scraping sound of glass against the cup's base as deliberate as a hymn. The wine shimmered faintly in the candlelight, and he considered it beautiful. A vessel that carried both grace and ruin. The selection of the victim was as calculated as the act itself. He would choose one who had endured the earlier rituals long enough for the body to be hollowed out but not yet emptied entirely. He wanted them to survive for more than a single service after the drink, to feel the full length of the trial he had prepared. Removing them from the coffin took little effort. Their frail weight barely shifted the air. He sat them in the front pew, their heads supported so they could watch him as he stood at the altar. The chalice was brought forward in both hands as though in reverence, and he would tilt it to their lips with an expression of tenderness so convincing that an onlooker might mistake it for mercy. The first swallow was always hesitant, the body sensing something unnatural in the texture. But thirst overcame caution. They drank in small gulps, the glass descending like 1,000 invisible blades slicing into the throat, the stomach, the bowels. The pain was immediate yet silent. His earlier mutilations ensured that any attempt to cry out only produced a wet, choking gasp. Blood welled in their mouths but was swallowed again, staining their insides deeper. Meriwether called this filling them with light, for in his mind each shard carried purity into their bodies, cleansing them from within as they slowly bled into themselves. The agony came in waves. During the service that followed, he preached as though nothing had changed, his voice calm and unbroken, while his chosen communicant writhed subtly in the pew. The glass tore new paths with every breath, every involuntary shift, until the pain became a constant hum in their nerves. By the second service, their skin would be cold and clammy, their movements reduced to trembling. Yet he ensured they remained upright. bound by straps beneath their clothing so they would not collapse before the final hour. He took satisfaction in watching their eyes, how they dulled, how they drifted between the present and the fevered visions of a body shutting down from the inside. The psychological toll was as profound as the physical. They understood they were dying but were forced to endure it publicly, on display before the invisible congregation Merriweather claimed filled the room. He would lean close between verses, murmuring that the light was almost complete, that their suffering was the final proof of devotion. In these moments they sometimes tried to refuse the next sip, but his grip on the chalice was immovable, and he would tip it again until the liquid slid past their cracked lips. Death, when it came, was not sudden. It was a slow surrender, the body's systems failing one at a time while the mind floated in the half-conscious haze of pain and blood loss. The final breath was often taken during a hymn, their head lolling forward as though in deep prayer. Merriweather would pause only long enough to lift the body and place it among the others waiting for burial, then return to the pulpit, the chalice already cleaned and ready for the next. To him, the glass communion was the pinnacle of worship, a death that left no wound visible to the casual eye, no scream to disturb the sacred quiet, only the certainty that they had been filled to the brim with the light he promised. Outside, the absence of yet another townsman or wife would barely stir comment. Those who wondered did so in silence, for by now the pattern was clear. Once you sat at Merriweather's table, you never left the chapel again. Inside, the Reverend felt no grief, only the satisfaction of a ritual completed exactly as intended. The empty pew beside the altar would not stay empty for long. The next dawn was always waiting, and with it, the preparation of another chalice. By the winter of 1830, Merriweather's obsession had grown beyond the walls of his chapel. His congregation of the maimed, the starved, and the silenced was, in his mind, proof of a system that worked. Proof that the human soul could be reshaped through suffering until it bent without resistance. Yet to him, such work deserved a wider stage. He began to write at night, seated at his heavy oak desk while the faint murmurs of the dying drifted through the floorboards. The letters were addressed to men who wielded real power, bishops in England, colonial governors in the Caribbean, and most daring of all, the recently deposed King Charles VI of France, now living in exile. In each letter, Merriweather spoke of moral restoration through silence, a doctrine he claimed could repair nations weakened by rebellion and moral decay. He painted his chapel as a place where obedience was absolute, where no voice dared speak against the order of God, and where discipline had replaced chaos. The language was carefully chosen, wrapped in the soft phrasing of theology. He wrote of the need to strip away temptation by removing the noise of sin, a phrase that to the unknowing might sound like a poetic call to prayer, but to Merriweather held its truer, bloodier meaning. He described his congregation as unbroken in their attendance and steadfast in their gaze, omitting that their eyes were held open by the stiff rigor of bodies starved and bound in place. He hinted at the cost of such devotion, speaking of gradual refinement through the withering of the flesh, letting the reader imagine a fast or a humble retreat, not the prolonged torment of upright coffins and the slow shredding of organs from within. To King Charles VI, he was especially deferential, framing his work as a model for restoring royal authority. He suggested that entire communities could be brought to heel through chapels like his, places where faith and fear were indistinguishable, and where the will of God and the will of the sovereign would be taught as one. The king, displaced and desperate for any ideology that promised order, was the perfect audience for Merriweather's ambition. He enclosed with the letter a small token, a scrap of stiffened parchment, smoothed and trimmed into a neat rectangle. It was human skin, though tanned and cured so finely it might be mistaken for vellum. On it, In delicate ink, he had copied a verse about obedience. He offered it as a sample of the devotion his methods could inspire. The act of sending such a piece was more than arrogance. It was a declaration. Meriwether no longer saw his crimes as hidden sins. He saw them as a gift to be shared, a blueprint for control. In his mind, his role had shifted from shepherd of a single flock to architect of a greater moral empire. He believed he could plant these chapels of obedience across the American South, each one a sealed chamber where the faithful would be broken into perfect stillness. As the weeks passed without reply, he wrote more letters, each bolder than the last, revealing just enough to intrigue without exposing himself to outright condemnation. He spoke of silence as a currency, of pain as a form of loyalty. He recounted in careful, veiled language the endurance of those who had taken the glass communion and remained seated for days, their bodies resisting the pull of corruption until they were received into light. The descriptions were meant to be symbolic, but they were in fact precise accounts of the slow, deliberate deaths he had overseen. The psychological toll on his victims became a kind of ledger for him, proof that his theories were sound. Each letter he sent was a notch in his growing conviction that he was not a mere preacher, but a reformer whose reach would soon cross oceans. And though none of his recipients could have guessed the full truth, Meriwether's words carried the cold undercurrent of someone offering not just advice but a trade, moral order in exchange for power and protection. In the stillness of his study, surrounded by the scratching of his pen and the distant, labored breathing of those still clinging to life, Meriwether imagined a network of chapels stretching from the Virginia hills to the plantations of the deep South, each one filled with rows of silent worshippers, their devotion carved into them with the same precision as the pages of his altered Bible. In that vision, the sovereigns and bishops who answered him would not just be patrons, they would be partners in a quiet empire, one built not on faith freely given, but on obedience beaten, starved, and cut into the bone. And with each new letter sealed in wax, he believed the world outside was drawing one step closer to his truth. By late spring, the chapel's silence had taken on a different texture. It was no longer only the stillness of starved bodies and severed tongues. It had a low undercurrent, a sound that seemed to rise from the earth itself. At first it was barely noticeable, a faint vibration in the wooden floor when Meriwether walked to the altar. But during the organ hymns it swelled into something unnatural, a wavering harmony of groans and shallow breaths that bled into the music. He told himself it was the sound of souls passing upward, proof that his work was not bound to the visible congregation. In truth, it was the sound of the choir, those who had been taken long before and hidden beneath the chapel, in chambers so low they could not stand, so dark they could not see. These were the ones he considered his earliest instruments, too broken by hunger and pain to serve in the pews but still useful in the liturgy he imagined. He had studied old medical texts from his apprenticeship and pamphlets from English fumigation cures, treatments meant to purge sickness from the body by filling rooms with thick vapors of burning herbs and minerals. In the same books he found references to mercury, deadly in its fumes, corrosive to the lungs, and able to steal life without leaving the bloodied signs he so despised. He adapted the practice into his own ritual. Sage for purification, mercury for judgment. When combined and burned in the cramped air of the sealed chambers, the vapors forced themselves deep into the lungs, eating them from within. Meriwether timed it with precision. He would light the mixture in iron basins at dusk, letting the smoke curl through the vents that connected to the underground spaces. At first, the victims would cough violently, their weakened bodies straining to rid themselves of the poison, but the narrow walls and low ceilings trapped the air until every breath was tainted. As the hours passed, the coughing dulled to labored gasps, each inhale slower than the last, until the only sound was a drawn-out wheeze, like wind through a cracked reed. He listened for that moment, the shift from struggle to surrender, and only then would he sit at the organ above, his fingers pressing out long, solemn chords. The vibrations from the pipes mingled with the dying voices below, producing a sound unlike any hymn. To Merriweather, it was proof that he had bridged the space between heaven and earth, the breath of the dying rising in harmony with the praise of the living, or what he imagined as living. The deaths were never immediate. The fumes worked their way through the body slowly, collapsing the lungs, drowning the victim from the inside in their own fluids. Some lasted days in that half-life, each breath burning and cold, unable to call for help because their throats had long since been ruined. The darkness below the floor became a world without time, broken only by the creak of the boards when Merriweather walked above them, pausing as if to savor their ragged chorus. For those who survived more than one fumigation, the psychological destruction was complete. They learned to anticipate the shift in the air, the bitter metallic taste that crept into their mouths before the smoke became visible. Panic would take hold before the ritual began, their shallow, rapid breaths only pulling the poison faster into their lungs. Merriweather saw this fear as part of the worship, their dread transforming them into pure vessels for the song he believed they were meant to sing. From above, the townsfolk who dared to attend services sometimes noticed the strange undertone in the organ music, a soft, wavering moan that seemed to come from underfoot. Most told themselves it was the acoustics of the old building, the way sound traveled through wood and hollow spaces. No one asked why the Reverend's organ music was always so slow, so heavy, as if waiting for another voice to join it. And no one stayed long after the service ended. They claimed it was the cold draft, but deep down, they feared what might be moving beneath the floor. For Merriweather, each voice silenced in those chambers was another offering completed, another soul purified through the destruction of its body. He believed their final breaths did not disperse into the stale air but rose upward, curling toward the rafters before ascending to the God who, in his mind, had appointed him as conductor. And when one voice fell silent, he simply replaced it with another from the pews above, ensuring that the choir never lost its strength, and that the music of suffering would never truly end. The day the chapel doors were broken open, the sky hung low and heavy, as if the air itself knew what waited inside. For months, the town had been shrinking under the weight of unspoken disappearances, but it was the midwife's trembling voice that finally forced the sheriff to act. She swore she had seen one of the retreating women, gaunt, barefoot, and barely standing, being dragged into the chapel by the Reverend himself. That testimony, whispered in the back room of the general store, was enough to send 3 deputies and the sheriff up the winding dirt path. The door was barred from within, but it yielded under their combined weight, swinging open to a silence so complete it made the men hesitate on the threshold. The pews were full. Every seat was occupied, and for a moment the intruders almost believed the Reverend's long-standing claim that his congregation had been present all along. But the stillness was wrong. The bodies sat too upright, their clothes too perfect, their hands folded in impossible symmetry. The smell was a mix of incense, dried rot, and something sweetly metallic that clung to the lungs. Ash clung to the skin of the dead, a fine gray dust that softened the contours of their faces as if they had been sculpted from something fragile and burnt. It coated their hair, their shoulders, even the hems of their Sunday coats and dresses, and when one deputy brushed past a pew, a faint cloud lifted into the air and drifted toward the sunlight. It was only when the sheriff bent close to examine a woman in the front row that he noticed what was missing. The eyes were gone, not damaged, not collapsed in death, but cleanly removed. The sockets filled with smooth river stones polished until they shone faintly in the dim light. Each body was the same. The stones sat like watchful orbs, catching the glow from the candles that still burned at the altar. They gave the dead a strange, unified expression, serene but unyielding, as if they were guarding the secrets of their own suffering. Merriweather stood at the pulpit, unmoving, as though the sudden intrusion had not disturbed him in the slightest. He was dressed in his robes, his Bible resting open before him. His voice, when it came, was calm enough to still the movement in the deputy's hands. He told them God preferred eyes that could not stray, eyes that would never again turn toward sin or temptation. He spoke as though this removal was not an act of cruelty, but of reverence, an offering to keep his congregation pure for eternity. The truth of how they had died was harder to face. Their skin beneath the ash bore the subtle patterns of heat damage like fine cracks in pottery. The air around them still held the faint acrid note of burned flesh, though no fire had touched the wood of the chapel. Later, it would be learned that Merriweather had sealed the windows and doors, burning slow heaps of resin and sulfur in metal basins between the pews until the air became a furnace of smoke. The bodies would have weakened first, the heat drawing every ounce of moisture from them, collapsing their lungs and parching their skin into a brittle shell. And in those final moments before death set them into the stillness the intruders now saw, Merriweather had knelt with his small, sharp tools, removing the eyes one by one, placing the cold stones into the empty space. To him, the ashen congregation was not a horror but an achievement, the perfect merging of discipline and devotion. Each death had been a step in a process, from the moment the victim was chosen to the moment their altered body took its place in the pews. And because the killings were carried out in the same place they had worshipped, Merriweather believed their souls would remain bound to him even in death. The ash was proof of purification, the stones proof of loyalty. For the deputies, the sight was worse than murder. It was an entire theology made visible in the flesh of the dead. The bodies were not slumped or discarded. They were displayed, honored in a way that twisted the meaning of honor itself. Even the air felt as though it belonged to the reverend, heavy and slow, waiting for his next sermon. And as the sheriff ordered the men to remove Merriweather from the pulpit, the reverend smiled faintly, glancing toward his unmoving congregation as if to remind them that nothing was truly over, that their eyes, stone or not, were still fixed on him. When they dragged Reverend Silas Merriweather from his chapel, the air outside was thick with a mixture of fear and relief. People stood in small, tight clusters along the road, staring as the man they had once called shepherd was marched through the mud in chains. His robe was streaked with ash, his hands still faintly stained in places where the skin had absorbed what no scrubbing could remove. The deputies moved him quickly toward the jail, yet even then his gaze wandered over the crowd, searching faces with the calm of someone who believed he was still in control. His congregation, those left alive, were gone now, the pews empty, the air inside the chapel silent except for the settling of wood. But to Merriweather, the service was not over. It had only been interrupted. In court, the weight of the crime should have been enough to hang him. The evidence was overwhelming. The ashen bodies with their river-stone eyes, the sealed chambers beneath the floorboards, still reeking of mercury. The upright coffins where emaciated figures had been kept alive past the point of reason. But the trial that should have been a reckoning became something else entirely. Local landowners, fearful of what a public trial might reveal about their own dealings with the church, whispered to the right ears. The hierarchy of the clergy, unwilling to let a man of the cloth be publicly dismantled, urged for another solution, one that would preserve appearances. The court declared him unfit for trial, citing a mind shattered by years of service and misplaced zeal. The ruling was read without emotion, and in that moment the Reverend became untouchable. No confession, no sentence, no gallows, only a quiet removal from public life. He was sent not to prison, but to the asylum on the outskirts of the county, a sprawling brick structure meant for the hopelessly insane, where records were easily altered and memories just as easily buried. The asylum staff had been warned that he was dangerous, but they saw at first only a soft-spoken man who quoted scripture in a steady, soothing voice. They did not notice the way he observed the other patients, studying their habits, learning their fears. Smuggled tools appeared in his possession within weeks. Small blades filed from scrap metal, needles hidden in the lining of his mattress, strips of cloth twisted into restraints. No one could say for certain how he acquired them. But in a place where oversight was loose and bribes were cheap, nothing stayed out of his reach for long. He began to work again, adapting his rituals to his new surroundings. The patients became his congregation, the dim asylum corridors his chapel. He sought out the most vulnerable first, those too broken to protest, and convinced the orderlies he was offering them comfort in prayer. Behind locked doors, he tested new methods. Some he silenced by packing their mouths with strips of wet cloth until their breathing was shallow and ragged, calling it stilling the storm within. Others he bound upright in corners for days, forcing them to listen to him recite psalms until their legs gave out and their minds drifted into delirium. In the asylum's basement, where the laundry boilers hissed, he found ways to channel steam into small rooms, watching through the half-open door as it stripped the breath from their lungs in slow, painful waves. Deaths were written off as accidents, the inevitable decline of damaged minds, but those who had seen the Reverend work before recognized the same pattern. Methodical suffering, each act calculated to extend the moment before the body gave up. The toll on those left alive was no less devastating. Patients began refusing to be alone with him, trembling when they heard his measured footsteps in the hall. Yet the staff, either blind or unwilling to look closer, continued to treat him as a harmless, if eccentric, former preacher. Then, in the spring of the second year, a fire tore through part of the asylum. Officially, it began in the records room, sparked by a fallen oil lamp. The flames consumed years of documentation, including every file connected to Merriweather's stay. Witnesses claimed to have seen him standing outside in the yard as the building burned, watching the smoke rise with an expression that could have been mistaken for satisfaction. By the time the ashes cooled, no one could produce a single page detailing what he had done inside those walls. The fire ensured his history there would be nothing more than rumor, but for those who had survived his hands there was no forgetting. They carried his work in the way their bodies shook at certain sounds, in the way their eyes darted to doorways as if expecting him to appear. The trial that wasn't had left him alive and free to continue, and in the minds of those who knew it was proof that the world would rather erase the truth than confront it. For Merriweather, the asylum had been no punishment. It had been another parish, and the work of salvation, as he defined it, had never once stopped. Years passed before the state moved to close the gaps that had allowed Reverend Merriweather to turn a house of worship into a chamber of slow and deliberate death. The changes came quietly, hidden in the folds of other bills. Language about the registration of private chapels, the requirement for regular inspections, the need for every congregation to be listed by name. There were no public hearings, no mention of the horrors that had driven these laws into existence. It was as if the legislature feared that speaking of them aloud might awaken whatever had lived inside that wooden building on the edge of the woods. By the time the bill was signed, the chapel was already gone, its roof caved in, its walls softened by years of rain and neglect. Nature had begun its slow erasure. Ivy climbed over the door frame where he had once stood to greet his chosen, and saplings pushed up through the rotted floor where the pews had sat in their perfect rows. In the churchyard where the last of the townsfolk once gathered to whisper about the disappearances, a single stone was placed. It was large and unmarked except for a verse chiseled deep into its surface. "Let all the earth keep silence before him." There were no names, no dates, no record of the men, women, and children who had filled those pews in their final moments. The decision to leave it anonymous was deliberate. Officials said it was to preserve the dignity of the dead, but the truth was simpler. There were too many missing for the town to face, too many families that would rather carry the weight of uncertainty than the finality of knowing. Without names, the stone became less a memorial than a warning, though even that message was easy to ignore. The site drew fewer visitors with each passing year. By the third decade after the Reverend's removal, only the occasional historian or drifter walked the overgrown path, and even they rarely stayed long. The air still felt wrong there, thick and unmoving, as if the soil itself held its breath. Some claimed to hear faint sounds under the ground when the wind pressed hard against the trees. A low murmur like the hum of an organ's pipes far beneath the earth. Others said it was only the roots shifting in the dark, but no one lingered after hearing it. What Merriweather had built did not vanish with the collapse of his chapel. The methods he refined, the slow starvation, the silencing, the stripping away of flesh and will, had been passed on in whispers, in fragments of paper found in abandoned trunks, in the memories of those who had survived his hands only to disappear elsewhere. Institutions, cloaked in respectability, adopted echoes of his work, dressing it in new language, hiding it in wards and schools and workhouses. The cruelty persisted because it had proven itself effective not just in breaking bodies, but in teaching entire communities to look away. The law had been changed, but the law was not the point. Evil like Merriweather's did not need the cover of legal freedom to thrive. It needed only silence. It needed people willing to believe that no news meant no harm. That absence could be explained away if no one asked too many questions. His congregation had been destroyed in full view, and yet the world outside had carried on, unmoved until the stench seeped under the door. That truth lingered heavier than the memory of his methods. The stone in the churchyard remains, weathering under decades of sun and rain, the verse still legible, but the edges worn soft. It stands over a ground that was never properly consecrated, over the remains of those who had been called disciples but left as ash. It asks for silence, but its presence is the loudest reminder of all, that silence is where men like Merriweather find their foothold. And as the years turn, and the path to the yard disappears under weeds, the question becomes not whether his kind will return, but whether anyone will notice when they do. What do you think? Could this happen again?